Hi, everybody. My name is Neil Seidman, and I'm co-chair of the Public Education Committee for ADAA. That's the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. And welcome to our webinar, Addressing Systemic Racism, a Call to Action for Allies. And our presenter is Dr. Kimberlye Dean. Thank you, Dr. Kimberlye, for joining us.
Thank you.
And these webinars are presented by the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, which is the leading nonprofit organization in the field of anxiety and depression. Our mission is to improve diagnosis and to promote the prevention, treatment, and cure of anxiety, depression, and stress-related disorders through education, like this webinar, through practice and research. So please take advantage of just really phenomenal resources on our website, adaa.org. And one of the things you'll find right from the homepage is a really great list of treatment providers. Just click on Find a Therapist. And we also have a free peer-to-peer online support group, which you can also find right from the homepage. If you have a question after watching the webinar, feel free to send an email to webinars@adaa.org. And Dr. Kimberlye will get to the questions, as she is available to, but we'd really be happy to get your questions. And finally, you can support ADAA by making a small charitable donation on our website. So let's get started. So I'm really pleased to introduce our presenter. Dr. Kimberlye Dean is a postdoctoral clinical research fellow in community psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Dr. Kimberlye's research interests include substance abuse and anxiety-related disorders, particularly among racially and culturally diverse populations. And her research is really focused on marginalized communities and aims to better understand the barriers to mental health treatment, how to improve the quality and access to mental health care, and to further advance evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, among these marginalized communities. So I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Kimberlye, and let's see if we can turn things over so she can show her material for us.
All right. Thank you so much, Neil. I think we are ready to get started here.
Yeah, looking good.
Looking good? All right. I am delighted to be here discussing how to address systemic racism and specifically a call to action for anyone who's interested in being an ally in this endeavor. So during this discussion, I'll really be discussing the scope of the systemic racism problem in the United States. Before I turn to talking a little bit more about, how this problem impacts communities in the U.S. as well. And I also want to leave you with some concrete steps. So for a 4-step process to being an ally that supports Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the midst of this chronic stressor. Okay. So the problem, what is systemic racism? I want to start off by giving the sort of literature or textbook definition of what this is. And the literature really defines systemic racism as an interconnected system of discriminatory practices, policies, and inequalities in the health and criminal justice systems that lead to systemic inequality in quality of life between races. And
So that's an interesting definition, and because
yes,
we hear a lot about the racism in the criminal justice system with policing and enforcement and happens in the courts. And also, what you're really highlighting for us in this webinar is the inequities in health systems, so the medical, and also what ADAA is, of course, mainly focused on in the mental health.
right.
And the access to mental health resources just being one part of this. So this is really interesting to hear you explain systemic racism as being this broad issue.
Right. That's exactly right, Neil. I think that, there's been an enormous amount of focus on sort of one aspect of the system and how systemic racism sort of infiltrates the criminal justice system. But I think it's extremely important to note the number of sort of disparities in access to healthcare, disparities in insurance status that cannot be overlooked as it relates to folks just being able to even, go to the doctor, go and get mental health care. I think that it's a big problem that only some folks are talking about here. And what's also really important here is to make a distinction and sort of differentiate what most people are familiar with, which is known as individual racism. So that could be things like pretty overt discriminatory practices, whether that's hate crimes or racial slurs, that sort of thing. I think when people think of the word racism, that really is what comes to mind. But I want to make that distinction here because this sort of unequal practices and policies that are in place and that we've sort of seen in these various systems are just as detrimental. And I want to sort of highlight the importance of individuals within these systems, right? I've heard many folks who are interested in being allies and interested in what they can do to help the systemic racism problem. And a lot of folks have come to me saying, well, I don't really know what I can do as an individual person. And I want to encourage folks to recognize the power that they do have as an individual to sort of push forward changes and push forward different policies that could be in place.
Yeah, wonderful.
Right. So moving on to just kind of getting a sense for how systemic racism really impacts communities in our country, in the United States. So, specifically, the majority of the literature has been kind of focused primarily in on the individual level, as we've discussed. However, a number of studies, large-reaching, far-reaching studies have examined and seen that experiencing discrimination has been consistently linked to poorer physical and mental health outcomes. So that includes higher cortisol levels, greater depression and anxiety. And as we've defined and kind of identified, systemic racism really impacts the ability for folks to access and navigate various systems in a meaningful way. And that difficulty in accessing these systems in a way to help their livelihoods and lives overall really obstructs overall quality of life improvements for these individuals. So
That's a really big challenge. Is not, I mean, it just I'm experiencing, if I'm experiencing just the ongoing stress of discrimination as I go through my day, and then in addition to that, I don't have good access to getting help.
Right. That's exactly right. It sort of just creates this kind of, cyclical thing that we're really, really interested and tasked with starting to break down so that we're able to make some lasting changes on a number of health disparities in these communities. So I've started off with the problem, so the scope of what's going on. and I want to transition to the solution. So, what can folks do to be part of the solution, and what does it really mean to be an anti-racist BIPOC ally? Um,
And
so,
BIPOC,
yep,
could you explain?
of course. So, just as a reminder, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Um, so
So I like
here,
that term because it's
uh-huh.
encompassing. Yeah.
Right. Oh yes. I think that this isn't just something that is focused on one, community of color. I think it's really, really important to recognize that these systems that are in place impact, you know, individuals of color in all kinds of ways. And so, I think that it's really, really important to utilize the terminology, BIPOC. Mhm. So as it relates to just what an ally is, the main definition um, in the dictionary for an ally is an individual who is utilizing their resources, utilizing their time, efforts, and energy in order to further a cause, an activity, or a struggle, or to help improve a struggle, rather. And my main point here, the key takeaway, if you take nothing else away from this webinar, is that in order to be an ally, behavioral action and support is absolutely needed and absolutely crucial. And we're going to get it into a little bit more so about what that behavioral action could be and could look like in individual folks' lives as well. I do want to, start us off by talking a little bit about just anti-racism in general. I know it's been a bit of a buzzword that folks are sort of hearing more and more about. But really, when you see the phrase anti-racism, all that really means is it's the practice of identifying, not only identifying when something racist is occurring, but also doing what you can to eliminate that by changing, systems, policies, and then even at the smallest level, attitudes within your own communities, within your own groups, in order to make these changes. Okay. So, with that being said, we are going to be talking about a four-step process of acting as a BIPOC ally. It starts with reflecting with yourself and really asking yourself difficult questions in some ways. Um, Step two is reflecting with close BIPOC friends. Step three is reflecting, following conversations that you may be having with folks about race and racism, particularly in the context of everything that's been going on in 2020. And then lastly, we'll round it out by talking about how to practice anti-racist behaviors in everyday life.
So the first three steps, I'm hearing a lot of maybe getting some insight and observing and maybe just accepting what is going on.
Right.
I may not like it, it might make me uncomfortable, but it might lead me to some insight about what's going on with
Right.
myself, with friends that are part of the BIPOC communities, and then maybe noticing what's happening now in conversations that I'm involved with or that I'm witnessing. So that didn't solve anything, but it like maybe led to some, might be shown some light on
Mhm.
issues. And then the last part is then where you're going to share with us, what can I do?
That's exactly right, Neil. And as I'll get into the next step, the first three steps are extremely important before you're able to utilize and practice anti-racist behaviors in everyday life. You really kind of need to have a sense of where you're starting from in order to enact some positive changes here.
I like your approach.
Yes, no, of course, of course. And so here, I want to start off by talking about the first step. So reflecting with yourself. So within step one, the really main goals here is starting out by just kind of continuing your education about anti-racist behaviors, and eventually getting to the point where you're questioning your own behaviors. So within this, we've talked about how systemic racism impacts systems at all levels, in the United States. And so that also includes the education system. So some of these concepts are very new to folks, like, anti-racism, what could potentially be, known as white privilege and all of that sort of thing. And in order to, enact some positive changes in the community, we really got to get a handle on what are these concepts? What do these things mean? How do they show up in reality? And so there are a number of resources, and we'll towards the end of our talk today be talking about these resources in more detail, but a number of books, including How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, that really touch on all of these sort of educational terms and concepts that are important to really grasp before we're able to move on to discussing the behaviors piece. So
Does any example come to mind of something that might occur to an ally as I'm doing this first step and I'm just wanting to reflect on?
right. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a great question, Neil. Oftentimes, when folks are really first starting to think about these things in a very kind of concrete way, and not only that, but then starting to question their own behaviors, there are a lot of emotions that come up, right? A lot of emotions, including some anxiety, maybe some anger, maybe some sad feelings, and maybe it's maybe even difficult to even identify what emotion it might be. It could just be a sort of general feeling of uncomfortable or a comfortableness about all of this. And so that's why the first step is so important. Just reflecting and taking the time with yourself to be able to kind of work through sort of what's coming up for you as you're learning about this stuff, and kind of understanding more so why you're having the emotional reactions that you might be having to some of the terms that you're coming across in this education. Mm-hmm. Right. So step one, as I've mentioned, read, become familiar with concepts related to systemic racism, continuing to seek out educational opportunities in this area, whether that be in books, the media, just learning about history in general. I know one of my friends who is very committed to being a BIPOC ally has taken like an additional history class in order to really get a sense of what is the history of our country, how have we gotten to this place with race relations in America, and really kind of getting a sense of the scope of the problem as a whole. So step two in reflecting with yourself, after you're reading, asking yourself, concretely, what actions have I perhaps engaged in, even unknowingly or unwittingly, that may have contributed to systemic racism as a whole? And so when I'm talking to folks about this, typically what I'm hearing, things that could come up could be things like saying things like, I'm not racist, but maybe not necessarily speaking up when you are seeing things that are being done or seeing things that are being said, whether that's in closed groups, closed communities, where certain folks aren't necessarily present. I think that in and of itself kind of goes into this piece of, one of the most important things of being an ally is starting to, reflect with yourself and try to kind of enact change within your own self, but also sharing with others and trying to eventually change attitudes over time.
And it could be uncomfortable in a situation that you're like what you're describing for me to speak up. The party that's expressing the racist point of view or discriminatory comment or behavior may not like me speaking up.
Right. Oftentimes that is the case. And oftentimes that's what holds people back from speaking up, right? And so, in kind of this space of reflecting with yourself, you are able to anticipate what others would say, what others might say, their reactions could be, so that you can then kind of know, well, what do I want to do in that situation? If a friend of mine, a loved one, I say something to them in a way that they don't necessarily agree with, and they have negative reaction, how might I handle that? I think before you're getting into those conversations, reflecting with yourself and understanding what you want to have happen in the conversation, how you want to handle yourself in that is very, very important before you're ever in that situation. It can help to reduce anxiety before you're having these conversations with folks. And it can also help you to just feel more prepared and feel good about how the interaction goes, even if it's not necessarily, you're not going to change someone's mind in a day or in one conversation. This is an ongoing process for sure. Yeah. All right. And so starting with reflecting with yourself and continuing this process throughout is extremely important here. And moving on to the next important step here. So reflecting with close BIPOC friends. The key goal here is reflecting with your own inner circle about what's happening, about what's coming up for folks. Further engaging with and listening to these close BIPOC friends, and ultimately overall just having fun with these folks. I think that, the first step here is really reflecting with the members of your own inner circle and kind of understanding within your own inner circle. So folks that you feel very comfortable with, you feel like you can tell them anything, kind of taking stock and looking around and seeing, do I have close BIPOC friends? And really kind of understanding if I don't, or if I perhaps maybe only have one, why may that be the case? Has there been, past history of avoiding either places and or avoiding virtual spaces where BIPOC folks tend to hang out? I think, again, sort of getting a sense of why that is for yourself, and getting a sense for if that, what you want to continue to do or how you want to continue living as an ally, then those are questions that will need to be answered. But I think starting with reflecting on who's in your inner circle is an extremely important first step here.
And then I like the step 2, inviting discussions of race and racism, and an ally being a good listener.
Right. So step 2 is, I find folks oftentimes find to be the most difficult piece, is the inviting the discussion of race and racism via asking. It For a lot of folks, we have been sort of conditioned and taught to not talk about race, to not sort of talk about racism in a very open way. And on the one hand, there's a sense of not wanting to ruffle feathers and not wanting to, create sort of contention and whatnot. But on the other hand, it sort of allows what's essentially been going on, for as long as we were all here, to kind of continue going on unchecked. And so it's extremely important that we begin to have these discussions, these frank discussions, in a way that is done with care. So it's not necessarily go out to any and all BIPOC folks that you interact with and discuss these things, because let me tell you, I can guarantee you that they're probably having these discussions with 6, 7 other people, even right now as we speak. But more so, this is really, really important for your own inner circle. So the folks who are very, very close to you, having these frank discussions, with these important people, is going to be the way to kind of start to just kind of assess where their attitudes are, and start to see if there's any changes over time, if they're having some negative thoughts in this way. And so asking is really, really important. I know that it can be difficult for a lot of folks, and so that's why kind of reflecting with yourself before you get to this piece is crucial here for sure. Okay. And then step 3, I think this one is also one of the most important steps here. Don't forget to simply be a friend to a close BIPOC friend in general. So particularly during this time, 2020 has been an extremely difficult year for us all. And so just being there for folks, spending time doing fun things, enjoyable activities, research has shown can help reduce feelings of loneliness, help reduce anxiety and depression, all of that type of stuff. And so, it doesn't necessarily, every conversation that you have with your BIPOC friend doesn't necessarily have to be about race and racism. It really is just, being there for someone, and kind of being a support, and a comfort in that way as well. Very important. Okay. And so after we're done reflecting with our friends, it's really important that we sort of start to think about how the conversations about race and racism actually went, right? A lot of times what folks kind of end up in is this experience of, well, that was really difficult. I feel like I just made people angry. I don't think I want to do that again. And then they sort of shut down and never want to talk about race or racism ever again. In order to kind of continue moving forward, continue evolving as a country, we really, really need to sort of understand what's going on within our own selves after these discussions happen. You know, as
Even
I
if it
mentioned,
was a difficult conversation, maybe I can learn something from that experience. Maybe something valuable did happen, even though it was uncomfortable or upsetting, or maybe
mhm,
learn for the next
mhm.
conversation.
That's exactly right, Neil. Particularly when the conversation is uncomfortable, like I mentioned, there is a tendency for folks to just avoid that, to not kind of lean into that discomfort. But in being an ally, that really is one of the most important things that you can do, is when the conversation is uncomfortable and you do feel anxiety or angry or whatever it may be following it, kind of trying to understand within your own self of why you may have felt these things during the conversation. Was it, and sort of, when you were feeling these things, did that then kind of steer the conversation away from the purpose of the discussion, right? Because the goal here is not necessarily to talk about your own anxiety and anger as it relates to these things, but it's more so talking about what can folks actually do to make actual change happen. It's in some ways being able to discuss your emotions about it can be helpful. But at this point, as I mentioned, going back to the original definition of ally, it's not just about the emotional support, it's about the behavioral action that needs to happen in order to make changes in the system. Mhm.
Now, I have a reflection that just came to mind as you were going
Yeah.
through about conversations that I've witnessed, mainly witnessed, where the challenge in the conversation about, and it was about racism, was one party's, the BIPOC person, sharing their experience or their feelings about something that happened, and then a person like saying, "Oh no, that wasn't really racism,"
Right.
uh,
Right.
and like knocking heads over that issue.
Mhm.
And the idea that I just got as you were talking is, well, the next time I'm in a conversation like that, instead of engaging in a battle about whether something is racist or whether it isn't racist, how about listening to my BIPOC friend and just what was their experience in either hearing the news story or having their own experience, or whatever that experience was that for them was challenging. And if I, as an ally, can I just open up and listen and just be receptive to hearing what that experience is like?
Right. Neil, that is exactly right. And let me tell you, a lot of times, during these conversations, as I've mentioned, and I've been kind of mentioning over and over again, that people feel uncomfortable during this, and that there oftentimes is an avoidance that comes when these discussions come up. And leaning into the discussion, leaning into the listening is very, very important here. Doing it in a way where you're taking care of the other person, you're actually, as you mentioned, Neil, actively listening to the person. That is the key here. It's not necessarily, when you're getting to the discussions, the goal is not to prove was XYZ racist or not racist. Not the goal at all. The goal is to understand from the other person's perspective, how it impacted them, what they would have wanted to have had differently. And as an ally, trying to understand what can your role be in being able to help them get there, being able to support them in that way. Because, ultimately, in order to kind of get any sort of leeway and changes in policies and whatnot, we've got to begin to have these conversations. We've got to begin to kind of bring these things up to people in power who have the power to change the policies. So without having this conversation, without listening to folks, we never get to that next piece. Great question, Neil. Great comments. And so in getting back to reflecting after the conversation, you really, once again, want to understand your own behaviors during these discussions. Understand, are you avoiding the conversation? Are you trying to shut down the conversation? Are you sort of, listening as best you can? And you want to understand whether your behaviors were really helpful or whether they were hurtful towards encouraging more discussions about race and racism overall. Because that's really the goal here, is to continue these conversations so that folks in power eventually over time will have no choice but to take a look at what's going on.
I just, before you go on, I just want to like reinforce this idea that even though these conversations might be really uncomfortable, that they're really a key part of being an ally.
Right, right. That's exactly right, Neil. And so moving on to step 4. So practicing anti-racist behaviors in everyday life. So I have made this list kind of an introductory list on purpose, because part of this practicing anti-racist behaviors is starting to understand within your own life what is that going to look like? How is that going to show up? But I want to start off with a few examples here to kind of give you some ideas of how to kind of take these topics that we've discussed today and really begin running with them. So we've talked, extensively today about the importance of talking about the presence of systemic racism and developing an actual action plan that could impact your own circle. So, that's going to be perhaps at work groups, within work meetings where folks are sort of checking in on others, checking in on individuals, seeing how they're doing. Perhaps in your leisure activities when you're kind of noticing, if there are no folks of color in the room, even kind of bringing those things up and discussing them as a group. And then not only that, but moving from the discussion to an actual plan of what can we do to make that happen? What can we do to make that change? And sort of discussing, how important it is that we do make those changes. It's really, really important that this starts within your own self, you reflecting, understanding your own emotions, kind of being able to identify what those things may be, understanding your own behaviors, how they have contributed over time. But in order to be a true anti-racist BIPOC ally, it ends with you continuing to reach out to folks in your own community, in order to really assess what we have in place already and assess if that's how we want to continue doing things going forward. And so, with that being said, I want to have us end a little bit more so on the common pitfalls that I oftentimes hear folks who are sort of new to this, really trying to get a sense of how to be an ally, things to just kind of be aware of and to try our best to avoid, falling into some difficulties. As you're doing some of what we've talked about today, there are going to be some challenges, and I want to make that very, very clear and very apparent. But at the same time, with an open and honest and listening heart, you can definitely enact change in your own community. So with that said, I want to talk a little bit more so about some pitfalls that folks sometimes fall into here. So going back to step 2, when you're reflecting with a close BIPOC friend, you once again don't want to expect or ask that your friend prove that their experiences have been discriminatory. This oftentimes is very invalidating and oftentimes may discourage them from discussing issues of race and racism with you in the future. Oftentimes I know folks want to, as we've discussed earlier, sort of not necessarily want to identify that could have been what was part of their experience. At this point, I think it would be more helpful to really just focus on how their experience, what their experiences was, how that impacted them, how that impacts their ability to move in that space as well. Just to kind of really
To just listen and honor the experience that they had instead of trying to debate about, well, I wouldn't have felt that way, or I can't know what your experience was. So how about just listening and
Right,
acknowledging the experience?
right. That is exactly right, Neil. And the goal here is never to get into debates. The goal is to simply listen to another's perspective that may be different from your own.
Yeah.
Okay. Another common pitfall that often comes up for folks, specifically when practicing anti-racist behaviors in everyday life, you really want to avoid giving into feelings of guilt and anger and act without listening to BIPOC friends or others in that community. Oftentimes, when folks are really gung ho and they're excited about being an ally and they want to do good, they want to help, they will sort of go in, full cylinders, excited, without remembering the most important piece, which is listening to that community, listening to those individuals, and understanding what it is that they need of support from you in that moment. Oftentimes, you can get into some slightly awkward situations of doing things that folks may not necessarily have asked for. I think a good example of that, I know that for several months ago, there was the Black Flare that was being sort of put up on Twitter, on Instagram, kind of all over social media. And over time, in the Black Square, to jog people's memory, was in response to sort of in solidarity for the Black Lives Movement and all of that. And on the one hand, great perspective, great sort of energy with that, but it started to kind of drown out the voices of folks in that community because so many people were doing it all at once. So I think that's a really, really small example, but a great example of how listening to members of that community is so, so important in order to be an effective ally here.
Instead of just jumping into some action without doing that first.
Yes, exactly right. And here, another common pitfall, we really want to avoid having these, we really want to avoid not having these discussions in the future. So really being able to make sure that these discussions lead to actual behavioral action on your part. What I've seen time and again is folks will, again, be very excited, sort of jump in there, start with the discussion, start with the committees and meeting and whatnot, and really wanting to start doing things. And then somewhere along the way, the outcome of those committees will never come to fruition. The outcome of retaining BIPOC at work or other leisure activities never comes to fruition. And that in and of itself is one of the key important pieces of being an ally here, is that you're trying to increase representation so that perhaps some of these policies and practices that are in place will be challenged more often. And without being able to get to that piece of the policies and the practices being challenged, we need more representation on these committees, on these boards. And so, continuing to have these discussions is a great first step, but we've got to get to an actual behavioral action plan that is enacted. It's very, very important here.
And to be consistent and maybe even have some patience or persistence anyway with
Right.
whatever the contribution that I'm making, whether it's local government or
Mm-hmm.
mission or whatever that opportunity might be.
Right. Right. And exactly what you said, Neil, reminds me of the importance of behavioral action could take the place of, or take the form rather of physical, like space and bodies in a place, of time that you're devoting to certain things, sometimes of financial resources directed towards specific organizations in that community. This behavioral action can really take the form of in many different ways. But it is important that there is some sort of kind of concrete behavioral things that are done in order to enact change and to help improve this systemic racism problem, for sure. Yeah. All right. And so with that, I'd like us to end here on discussing the continuing education piece, which again, if we want to loop back to the very beginning of the process, is step one of reflecting with yourself. So I have a number of resources here. So How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, as I mentioned earlier. White Fragility, Why Is It So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo, and a number of others that sort of discuss systemic racism at an academic level, but it also discusses systemic racism at a more sort of accessible level as well. So in a more narrative, it sort of describes and pulls from some of the history books as well, to really paint a picture of how we've gotten to where we are. Mm-hmm.
So one of the productive actions for me in being an ally could be just choosing one of these books.
Yeah.
And maybe
yeah.
for the chapters, because this is not information that I've gotten in school or that even read on news websites or internet resources. But I could see how any one of these could be really helpful. Just picking one, getting it on, hard copy, an actual book or a Kindle, and reading a chapter or two and seeing if I can learn something new that could really kind of broaden my perspective on what does it mean for me to be an ally.
That's exactly right, Neil. I think that once again, in order to be an ally, you gotta start with the educational piece. You gotta start with being able to kind of understand how does this what I'm learning here relate to my life, and what are some ways that I find myself kind of engaging in some of these behaviors that I'm reading about here. Once you're able to do that and you're reflecting with yourself, that's when the rest will come. Being able to discuss more, once you know more, once you have a general educational sort of background to these things, you'll be able to talk about these things more concretely with folks. And then after that, you'll be able to bring these things up to the powers that be in order to start to enact change as well. I think that the education, as you mentioned, Neil, and as I've discussed earlier in the webinar, that this is indeed something that has been left out of the majority of our education process in the K through 12 process. And I don't think that that's necessarily, a sort of, perhaps I guess you could consider it to be an oversight, but I think that as we're continuing to understand these things, learning more about one another, learning more about each other's perspectives, getting a sense for how these things are working within everyone's lives, and what it actually means to live an anti-racist life. I think it's vital education that we all need, and that we all need at a young age as well. So
Yeah,
I
and
think
this could introduce another possible area for good actions as an ally is, am I in the education field? Could I have some input into curriculum that would include some of these resources? Am I a parent that could have input into including some of the sources into, K through 12, college level? And those are really productive actions, I think, as well. So I want to encourage our viewers, maybe pause the webinar video and maybe make a note of one of these books. And I'm hearing that the first one is one that maybe you especially recommend, the Kendi book.
I do especially recommend the Kendi book for multiple reasons. One, in terms of, as we mentioned, the importance of putting sort of time and effort back into, communities of color. Ibram X. Kendi is a Black man, and has dedicated his life really to researching the way that racism works within our society and ways to start to dismantle these things. And so I think it's extremely important that he is supported in that way. Additionally, the way that he really describes these things, it's really described in a very easily accessible way. I think that another good piece, as I mentioned right below there, is White Fragility. particularly as you're starting to kind of work through what's coming up for you, perhaps as you're having these discussions with folks. And
Now that one I've heard the concept,
right.
and
Mhm.
it was very interesting when I first saw that. I said, "Oh, that's an interesting way of describing our white people's resistance to talking about racism." It's like it'll upset me. It'll, maybe I'll say something wrong, or maybe I'll get angry, or I'll get defensive, or
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
that's a really, really good topic as well. So you recommend that? That sounds like maybe the second recommendation.
I definitely recommend, and actually, as we're talking about this, I believe that Dr. D'Angelo has made the book publicly available, is my understanding, really in order to devote the majority of the financial resources that are being spent on some of these books to communities of color. So I believe at this time that you are able to get White Fragility online. So
So
that's
just Googling the title and we could
mhm,
see. Yeah.
right, right, yeah.
Yeah. And then we may as well go through the rest of them. So the next one sounds fascinating, where it gives like a historical context.
Oh yes, yes, and that's another one by Ibram X. Kendi as well.
Oh, that's also
It's
by Kendi. I
Yes,
see.
yes.
Okay.
And again, like getting a very, very clear understanding of the history of this country, the history of where some of these ideals have come from and how they're continuing to work in our everyday lives even now is invaluable. I think that once you start to kind of understand where we started from, you really start to see a lot of parallels to what's happening right now. And so being able to see these things will help you to know when to speak up, when you're in these meetings at work, when you're in these meetings in your leisure activities, and if you're starting to see some of the same patterns continuing again. Hmm.
Well, one of the things that I'm taking personally from this webinar is I'm going to get at least one of these books
Yes, I hope you
and
do.
start reading.
Right. Additionally, and I do want to go down the line there to
Yes.
Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. That one is a particularly almost written in a lyrical way. So it's again kind of really pulls from the history of America and all of that stuff, but it's really presented in a way that can be very very, very enjoyable to read, and is a bit more of a narrative piece as well. Hmm.
Okay. And then the last one, that's kind of
Yes.
self-explanatory, talking about, and that's
Mhm.
that's a topic that I've learned a lot about as well, but
Right.
very
Hmm.
relevant to the systemic racism.
Yes, indeed. So really just getting a sense of how we've gotten to where we are with mass incarceration, how that impacts communities of color disproportionately, and what is needed in order for change to happen going forward. Hmm.
Wonderful.
Yes.
So any
Well,
last comments? Thank you so much. This is
of
really
course.
material.
Yes, I think if there's one thing that I can leave the viewers with, it's really this sense of taking care of others and taking care of yourself as well. So as you're an ally, I know I've had conversations with a lot of my friends who identify as white, um, sort of talking about this allyship and talking about sort of beginning to shift and to take on some of this emotional work and behavioral work that's needed. And there's this sense of how can I do it all, particularly in the context of this pandemic, in the context of everything else that's going on in 2020. And I think it's particularly important that as you're doing the 4-step process that we've discussed today, that you're once again checking in with yourself, checking in with people that you feel comfortable with, that you feel like have your back in some ways and can support you, so that as you're getting into struggles and you're getting into these discussions, and sometimes they can be very difficult to sort of get through, that you have the support there in order to continue your allyship, because without that support folks can get burnt out, and that ultimately doesn't impact the problem in a beneficial way, right? We want folks to be out here being an ally in a sustainable way, right? So once again, take care of yourself, taking care of others, and really, getting out there and trying to enact some anti-racist behaviors. So I'm so happy and delighted to have been here with everyone. I hope that you connect with me on Twitter. You can connect with me at Dr. Kimberlye. That's spelled DrKimberlye. And without further ado, that's all I had for you guys today.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kimberlye, and I want to thank everybody for watching and encourage you to share the webinar and like the webinar on YouTube. And if you have a question you'd like to email, the email address is webinars@adaa.org. So again, thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thanks everyone.